All right, about a century ago, the iconic and majestic bison was brought to the brink of extinction.
That's right, just a few remained in the heart of Yellowstone National Park.
What if the most celebrated wildlife comeback in American history was built on a secret that scientists only uncovered more than a century later?
Tens of millions of bison once moved across the North American interior in herds so vast they took days to pass a single point.
Yellowstone National Park holds the last wild bison population that has existed continuously on the same land since prehistoric times. For generations, those animals were called the purest bison on Earth, the gold standard of conservation. Then, in 2022, a DNA study changed everything anyone thought they knew about them, and the trail of answers leads directly back to just 23 animals standing in the snow of a Wyoming valley more than 100 years ago. How 60 million bison disappeared almost overnight. Before diving into what DNA revealed, there is a story of destruction that has to be told first, because without understanding how low things fell, nothing about the recovery makes any sense. When European settlers began arriving in North America, estimates from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service suggest that between 30 million and 60 million bison roamed the continent, thundering across the Great Plains in herds so vast that early travelers compared the site to a moving dark ocean stretching beyond the horizon. For indigenous nations across the continent, particularly the Plains peoples, the bison was not just food. It was clothing, shelter, rope, tools, and the center of spiritual life. Everything about those communities was built around the rhythm of the herds. Then came the slaughter. Beginning in the 1860s, the U.S. Army launched a deliberate campaign to force Native American tribes off their lands by eliminating the animal they depended on most. The strategy was not hidden. The Secretary of the Interior stated in 1873 that the civilization of native peoples was impossible while buffalo remained on the plains. And following that logic, the Army provided free ammunition to hide hunters who brought bison to the brink of extinction. Market hunters followed, stripping hides and leaving carcasses to rot across the prairie. The Great Plains turned white not from snow, but from millions of sun-bleached bones. The numbers collapsed with a speed that is almost impossible to absorb. In 1889, the chief taxidermist at the Smithsonian Institution counted only 541 bison remaining in the entire United States. Most of those were confined to zoos or small private ranches. The wild herds that had taken tens of thousands of years to build were gone in roughly 2 decades. Bison went from numbering an estimated 60 million individuals before the 1870s to becoming nearly extinct in the 1880s, as the Plains bison population underwent a severe population bottleneck caused by the mass slaughtering campaigns of that era. Poachers had no fear of punishment. Legal loopholes prevented strict penalties even if someone was caught inside a national park. The worst outcome a poacher typically faced was having equipment confiscated and being temporarily expelled from the park. That was not enough to stop anyone willing to sell a trophy buffalo head for $500, which is what the market was paying at the peak of the killing. Yellowstone, which had been established as a national park in 1872, offered some protection simply because soldiers were stationed there. But even with military presence, the poaching continued. By 1894, fewer than 100 bison remained inside the entire park. Congress finally acted that same year, passing the act to protect the birds and animals in Yellowstone National Park, which for the first time created real legal penalties for killing wildlife on public land. It became the first animal protection law of its kind in the United States. The law came almost too late. By the early 1900s, surveys of Yellowstone revealed an estimate that stopped everyone cold. According to the National Park Service, bison were almost extirpated before 1900, leaving a remnant indigenous herd of approximately 23 bison in the Pelican Valley of central Yellowstone. 23 animals. That was all that stood between total extinction and any possible future. To fully understand how catastrophic that number was, consider what biologists already knew even then. When a wild population shrinks to that level, the risks multiply fast. A single bad winter could wipe out calves. One outbreak of disease could sweep through the remaining adults. A drought, a collapse in food supply, or just a run of poor breeding seasons could finish the species entirely. 23 is not a safety margin. 23 is a countdown. It is worth pausing on those 23 animals individually for a moment because they are often treated in history as an abstraction, a data point in a conservation triumph, when in reality each one represented an irreplaceable thread connecting the species to its prehistoric past. These were Plains bison. Bison, bison, bison. A subspecies that had lived in the greater Yellowstone region continuously since before recorded human history. They had survived ice ages, human migrations, predator shifts, and volcanic eruptions in that landscape. What they very nearly could not survive was the organized, government-sponsored, economically driven campaign of their own extermination. The fact that 23 remained was not a conservation achievement. It was barely a miracle. It was the accidental product of remote terrain, hard winters that kept some hunters away, and the animal's own instinct to retreat deep into the park's interior when the killing started. George Bird Grinnell, an anthropologist and journalist, used the pages of the magazine Forest and Stream in the 1890s to expose the illegal poaching of the last wild bison in Yellowstone National Park. His reporting won the support of Theodore Roosevelt, then a civil service commissioner in Washington, who aggressively lobbied Congress to pass legislation with real teeth. That advocacy produced the 1894 Act, the country's first animal protection law. But even then, recovery was not guaranteed. It required money, will, and a willingness to bring in animals from outside the park, a decision that would leave a genetic fingerprint on every single Yellowstone bison alive today. And yet those 23 animals would become the foundation of something extraordinary, though the full truth of what was built on their survival would not emerge for another century. If that story of near collapse has you gripping the edge of your seat, what park managers decided to do next is the part that would quietly set the stage for a genetic revelation no one saw coming. The rescue nobody talks about, and the secret it left behind. In 1901, with only about 25 bison still alive in the park, the U.S. government made a decision that would shape North American wildlife forever. Congress appropriated $15,000 to purchase additional bison from private owners outside the park, bringing in animals to supplement the tiny wild remnant and give the population a fighting chance. In 1902, 18 cows arrived from the Pablo Allard herd in northern Montana, and 3 bulls came from the famous ranch of Charles Goodnight in Texas. Goodnight is one of the most recognized figures in Texas ranching history, known for driving cattle along the Goodnight-loving trail, but his role in saving the bison rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. His herd had been carefully gathered and protected largely at the insistence of his wife, Mary Ann Goodnight, who personally saw to it that orphaned bison calves found wandering near their ranch were saved and sheltered. Charles Goodnight sent 3 of his finest bulls to Yellowstone at his own expense, not because the government required it, but because he understood what was at stake. Those animals were taken to what would become known as the Lamar Buffalo Ranch in the Lamar Valley, a facility where bison were raised and managed more like livestock than wild animals. Corrals were built. Hay was grown on irrigated meadows. Ranch hands worked through brutal Wyoming winters to keep the animals fed and safe. For 7 years, the introduced bison were held in enclosures at Mammoth Hot Springs and Lamar Valley, managed intensively to optimize herd production. Calves captured from the wild Yellowstone herd were also folded in, mixing the last indigenous animals with the newcomers. The idea was sensible on its face. The wild population was far too small to survive on its own, so bringing in bison from outside could add numbers and genetic variety. What the park managers could not have known, and what would sit quietly hidden in the DNA for more than 100 years, was that those Montana and Texas animals carried something unexpected inside them. Here is where the story takes a turn that nobody anticipated. Charles Goodnight, for all his love of the bison, had also spent years trying to crossbreed bison with domestic cattle to create a hybrid animal he believed would be commercially valuable. He called these animals catalo. He openly wrote about his breeding experiments and told reporters that he had been trying for years to establish a race of cattle from the buffalo. His herd was a mix of full-blooded bison and animals with varying degrees of cattle ancestry. and the bulls he sent to Yellowstone came from that same population. The Pablo Allard herd in Montana had its own complicated history. It descended partly from bison gathered by a Pendoreles man named Samuel Walking Coyote, who sold them to ranchers Michel Pablo and Charles Allard in 1884. As that herd changed hands and grew, the extent to which some animals may have had contact with or crossbreeding with domestic cattle remained poorly understood. When those animals from Montana and Texas were brought into Yellowstone and eventually allowed to mix with the remaining 23 wild bison, the genetic legacy of all those crossings came along with them. Nobody at the time had the tools to detect it, and for decades, nobody went looking. The Lamar Buffalo Ranch was in operation from 1907 to 1952 as a facility to breed and feed bison in the park. By 1954, the combined population of wild and introduced bison had grown to roughly 1,300 animals. The operation was eventually shut down as wildlife management philosophy shifted toward letting bison behave as wild animals rather than managed livestock. The fences came down. The herds spread across the park. Numbers kept climbing. By the time scientists began looking closely at Yellowstone bison genetics decades later, the population had grown into the thousands. And the assumption that had settled firmly into conservation science was that Yellowstone bison were pure, the gold standard, the last unspoiled line of wild American bison untouched by cattle genetics. That assumption would not survive contact with 21st century DNA technology. Now that you understand exactly how the herd was rebuilt and what ingredients went into that rescue, what researchers found when they actually looked at the DNA is the part that shook the entire conservation world to its foundation. What DNA revealed 120 years later and why it shocked scientists. For years, a Texas A&M veterinary scientist named James Durr had been studying bison genetics. His work going back 2 decades had suggested that most bison herds in North America had been contaminated with cattle DNA at some point in their history, a result of the deliberate cross-breeding experiments that ranchers had conducted during the 1800s and early 1900s when bison numbers were so low that some breeders were actively trying to create hybrid animals. A few herds, including Yellowstone, had been identified in earlier studies as potentially free of this contamination, and that belief became a central pillar of how conservation managers valued those populations. Yellowstone bison were treated as a reservoir of genetic purity that needed to be protected and kept separate from other herds. Then genome sequencing technology improved dramatically. What had once required expensive, time-consuming analysis of limited DNA markers could now be done across entire genomes at a fraction of the old cost. Durr, working alongside colleague Brian Davis and PhD student Sam Stroop, decided to go back and look again with the new tools. In a study published in April 2022 in Scientific Reports, James Durr and Brian Davis, geneticists at Texas A&M, concluded that all the bison in North America have a legacy of hybridization. The technology they worked with was many times more powerful than what had been available during Durr's earlier research, and what it found inside bison genomes was unmistakable. The study, published in the journal Scientific Reports, revealed the strongest evidence to date that all bison in North America carry multiple small but clearly identifiable regions of DNA that originated from domestic cattle. The researchers compared genome sequences from the major historical lineages of bison against genetic data from 1,842 domestic cattle, establishing that every bison genome they analyzed contained evidence of cattle introgression. For the study, researchers sequenced whole genomes from 19 modern bison and 8 historical bison specimens taken from a variety of locations in the United States and Canada, collectively chosen to cover all known bison lineages. Sam Stroop combed through historical records to trace which bison came from what populations and where they ended up, connecting the paper trail of 19th-century livestock records with the genetic signatures found in modern animals. The picture that emerged was consistent and unavoidable. Today, it appears that all major public, private, tribal, and non-governmental organization bison herds have low levels of cattle genomic introgression. Stroop stated. This includes Yellowstone National Park as well as Elk Island National Park in Canada, which were thought to be free of cattle introgression based on previous genetic studies. That statement landed like a stone in a pond. Elk Island National Park in Canada had also been considered one of the purest remaining bison populations. Both parks, long held up as the twin pillars of bison genetic purity, turned out to share the same legacy of hybridization that had been hidden from researchers for generations. The mechanism behind that hidden inheritance was now clear. In Yellowstone, where the bison population hovered as low as 30 animals by 1900, wildlife officials had brought in bison from private herds in Texas and Montana to boost that population. Though these imported animals had a past history of hybridization with cattle, it was unknown how much cattle DNA they carried, if any. Now, with full genome analysis, the answer was confirmed. Those rescued animals had carried cattle ancestry into Yellowstone, where it had spread quietly through the growing herd across more than a century of breeding. The amounts of cattle DNA found were small. Researchers were careful to note that this was not a story of bison being secretly turned into cattle. The introgression was low-level, scattered across small regions of the genome, and the animals remained biologically and behaviorally bison in every meaningful sense. But the belief that any herd existed in a state of total genetic purity from cattle contact was finished. To put the scale of this finding into context, the cattle DNA regions identified in Yellowstone bison were tiny fractions of the overall genome. Scientists described them as clearly identifiable but not functionally dominant. The bison did not look like cattle, behave like cattle, or breed like cattle. Their ecological role in the Yellowstone ecosystem as a keystone grazer that shapes grassland composition, drives nutrient cycling, and supports dozens of other species remained completely intact. What the DNA showed was a ghost of history, the faint molecular signature of a desperate rescue conducted more than a century ago with the limited tools and imperfect knowledge available at the time. That rescue saved the species. The fact that it left a trace inside the genome is not a failure. It is evidence of the effort it took. James Durr noted that the findings would have direct consequences for how conservation managers approached bison herds going forward. If every major herd carried some level of cattle DNA, then the practice of isolating supposedly pure herds from all others to protect their genetic status would need to be reconsidered. Certain herds would no longer need to be managed in complete separation from other populations, which could actually make large-scale conservation efforts more flexible and more effective than they had been under the old purity framework. Stroop put the broader implication plainly. Though viewed in different ways, bison conservation is a priority to many different groups, and it is imperative that we agree to use the best available scientific information to make decisions moving forward. That 2022 study rewrote the foundational assumption behind bison conservation, but it was not the final word. 3 years later, the same research group would return to Yellowstone with a second genetic study, and what they found this time would be described not as a complication, but as a triumph. Before getting into what that 2025 discovery revealed, the full picture of what the original 23 animals survived and what grew from their numbers is what makes the next chapter genuinely extraordinary. From 23 animals to a single super herd. To understand the scale of what has been achieved, it helps to go back to what 23 animals actually means in biological terms. When a species drops to that number, geneticists call it a population bottleneck. The concern is not just that the animals might die out from sheer scarcity. The deeper problem is that with so few individuals, the genetic diversity of the entire species gets compressed into whatever variation those few surviving animals happen to carry. Every generation after that inherits from an extremely narrow genetic foundation, and over time, inbreeding can produce health problems, reduced immunity, and lower fertility across the whole population. The Yellowstone bison lived through one of the most extreme bottlenecks ever documented in a large mammal. The 23 animals that survived in Pelican Valley did not represent the full range of genetic variation that had existed across the original tens of millions. They were whatever happened to still be alive after the slaughter. Animals that had retreated deep into the park's interior and hidden in remote terrain where poachers either could not reach them or chose not to follow. The 2016 mitochondrial genome analysis of Yellowstone bison published in PLOS 1 and conducted by researchers including James Derr and Rick Wallen of the National Park Service, found that the modern Yellowstone herd carries two distinct genetic lineages. One lineage traces directly to the 22 or 23 indigenous animals that survived in central Yellowstone into the early 1900s. The other reflects the introduced bison brought from Montana and Texas in 1902. Those two lineages merged and expanded together over the following decades, producing the large and growing herd that exists today. In 1902, 18 cows were received from the Allard captive herd in Montana and 3 bulls from the Goodnight captive herd in Texas. The captive bison at the Lamar Buffalo Ranch were carefully fed through harsh winters, with ranch hands cutting and stacking 500 to 800 tons of hay each year to keep the animals alive. Calves from the wild herd were brought in to mix with the captive animals, and over the following decades the two populations slowly grew together. By 1916, there were 72 wild bison inside Yellowstone, alongside a captive herd of 273 animals at the ranch. By 1952, when the Lamar Buffalo Ranch operations were wound down and bison were allowed to range freely across the park, the population had grown to nearly 1,000 animals. By 1954, the numbers had grown to roughly 1,300 animals. The hands-off, wild management approach that followed allowed the herd to expand significantly. The growth, however, brought its own set of complications. As bison numbers climbed through the 1980s, the animals began following ancient migration routes that carried them out of the park and into Montana during winter months. Montana ranchers became alarmed, not about the bison directly, but about brucellosis, a bacterial disease that bison carry, which causes pregnant cattle and other ungulates to miscarry or produce weak young. The state of Montana sued the federal government in 1995 over the issue of bison crossing the park boundary, and between 1985 and 2000, approximately 3,100 bison were killed as they tried to migrate out of the park, through a combination of captures sent to slaughter, state agent shootings, and tribal and state hunting. The conflict between bison conservation and livestock management continues to this day. Yellowstone's most recent bison management plan, released in 2024, moved away from a politically driven population cap of 3,000 and adopted a range of 3,500 to 6,000 animals, using the Bison Conservation Transfer Program and tribal hunting as the primary tools for managing herd size rather than relying primarily on slaughter. In February 2026, the program completed its largest single transfer yet, with 213 bison sent to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, from where they would be distributed to tribal lands across North America through the Intertribal Buffalo Council. That program represents something that goes far beyond logistics. For the dozens of Native American tribes that lost their entire relationship to buffalo during the 19th century slaughter, the return of Yellowstone bison to tribal lands is a restoration of culture, food, sovereignty, and spiritual connection that no policy document can fully capture. Bison from the world's most famous wild herd are going home to the peoples who lived alongside them for thousands of years. Meanwhile, back inside the park, something had been happening to the bison that nobody fully registered until researchers looked closely at the genetics again. The two lineages that had been so carefully documented over the previous decades, the northern herd and the central herd, with their separate ranges and distinct breeding grounds, were blurring. The boundaries that had once separated them were dissolving as the growing population spread across more of the park, and animals moved between areas that had once functioned as separate territories. In a study published in the Journal of Heredity in 2024, researchers from Texas A&M analyzed 282 DNA samples taken from bison across the park, examining animals from the two major summer breeding groups and the two major winter ranges. What they found was that the genetic differences between those groups had faded. The animals were interbreeding across what had once been distinct population boundaries, and the result was a single genetically unified population that had not existed in that form for a very long time. Texas A&M researchers discovered that bison in Yellowstone National Park are now part of a single large interbreeding population derived from multiple historic bison herds. Population genetic studies completed just 20 years earlier had found that the bison retained their historic patterns and were, in fact, two unique herds living within the national park. That was no longer true. To get a clearer picture, we examined samples from the two major summer breeding groups and two major winter ranges. Sam Stroop, now a postdoctoral researcher at Texas A&M, explained in a 2025 press release. These are where we would expect to see examples of genetic difference and overlap. However, Yellowstone bison today are clearly one interbreeding herd. James Durr described the significance directly. This finding certainly has a direct impact on the long-term conservation and management of this iconic bison population, he said. The researchers published a recommendation that Yellowstone bison should now be managed as one large interbreeding population rather than as two separate herds, an approach that would allow for more accurate monitoring of genetic diversity and clearer policy decisions going forward. The practical implications are significant. Managing one unified population simplifies the tracking of genetic health, reduces the risk of policies that inadvertently favor one subgroup over another, and allows managers to understand inbreeding risk and overall herd resilience more accurately. Experts now recommend managing the Yellowstone bison as one large population with multiple subunits rather than continuing strategies based on two separate herds, a shift that reflects both the science and the new reality on the ground. The current Yellowstone bison population fluctuates between 4,000 and 6,000 individuals, a number that represents one of the most dramatic wildlife recoveries in American history. From 23 animals hidden in the snow of Pelican Valley to a thriving, genetically unified herd of several thousand, the journey took more than a century of protection, management, conflict, scientific discovery, and ultimately a willingness to let the animals live as they were always meant to. The DNA also added one final complication to the story of what purity means in conservation. The low-level cattle genetics found in Yellowstone bison do not make them less wild, less ecologically important, or less culturally significant. What they reveal is that the rescue itself, the act of saving the species, introduced a small genetic legacy from the domestic animals used in that effort. The purity was never absolute, and the search for total purity may have been a framework that the biology of the rescue never quite allowed. Yellowstone is the only place in the United States where bison have lived continuously since prehistoric times. That fact has not changed. What has changed is the understanding of what continuity actually means, built not from a pristine and untouched lineage, but from survival, adaptation, the mixing of wild and introduced bloodlines, and the steady, improbable recovery of a species that came within a bad winter of disappearing forever. The 23 bison that hid in Pelican Valley did not survive because conditions were perfect. They survived because they were still there when people finally decided to protect them. Everything that followed, the ranch, the breeding program, the genetic complexity, the unified super herd of the 21st century, traces back to those 23 animals and the decision to build something lasting from what little remained. That is not a story of purity. It is a story of resilience. And in the end, resilience turned out to be more powerful than purity ever could have been. What remains most striking about the entire arc, from the slaughter of the 1870s through the desperate count of 23 animals in Pelican Valley to the DNA revelation of 2022 and the unified herd discovery of 2025, is how much of it hinged on decisions made by a small number of people who had no guarantee that any of it would work. The ranchers who gathered orphaned calves in Texas and Montana, the park managers who spent federal money they barely had to buy supplemental animals, the journalists who exposed poaching at the cost of their own popularity, the scientists who kept returning to Yellowstone with better tools and bigger questions. None of them knew how the story would end. They acted on the belief that saving what remained was worth the effort, even when the numbers made extinction look almost inevitable. The 23 bison in Pelican Valley could not know they were the last hope of a species. The people protecting them did know, and they chose to protect them anyway. That choice is why Yellowstone still has bison today, and why those bison, carrying the complex genetic story of their own rescue inside every cell, are thriving. With this, we have come to the end of this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, Do well to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. To enjoy more thrilling stories, click now on the following video that pops up on your screen.